Cora. Cori Hayes had meticulously marked this specific date on her calendar many weeks prior, tracing the circle carefully with a slightly unsteady hand. December 7th, Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. It was the day the National Veterans Museum held its yearly commemoration, extending an open invitation for all who had served to enter entirely free of charge. At 87 years old, Cori's body was frail. She no longer drove, her sight had faded, her hands suffered from a persistent tremor, and her movements had slowed to a cautious shuffle. Yet her memory remained remarkably vivid, particularly concerning the years she spent in uniform. Korea in '52 and Vietnam in '68. These places and dates were engraved upon her soul with more permanence than the physical scars she carried. The required journey from her compact apartment necessitated navigating 3 distinct bus routes, which Cori timed with what felt like military precision. She rose well before dawn, allotting herself ample time to shine her old combat boots and press her faded army jacket. The Bronze Star Medal, securely fastened to her chest, briefly caught the morning light as she inspected her reflection. Her granddaughter had offered to drive her, but Cori had gently declined. "You have your own family to care for," she had told her. Truthfully, she preferred making this trip alone. Some pilgrimages, she felt, were meant to be solitary endeavors. The frigid December air bit sharply through her thin frame as she finally arrived at the museum's monumental entrance. Marble steps led up to imposing columns, and large banners proudly declared, "Honoring those who served, a special tribute." Cori paused, taking a moment to catch her breath before joining the line of visitors ahead of her. Families chattered excitedly. Several younger veterans, clad in crisp, modern uniforms, moved swiftly through the line, each presenting a military ID or VA card and receiving respectful nods from the security guard. A young man with a short-cropped haircut and a visibly bored expression. When Cori reached the front, she offered a gentle smile. "Good morning, son." "ID?" the guard asked, his voice flat, barely bothering to look up. Cori's smile remained steadfast. "I served in Korea and Vietnam, son," she explained. 38th Infantry Regiment in Korea, then Special Forces Advisory in Vietnam. The guard finally lifted his gaze quickly, scanning Cori's worn face, her trembling hands, and her faded jacket. "Ma'am, we require proper identification. Military ID, VA card, or discharge papers. We can't just allow anyone to claim they're a veteran." "I haven't carried an ID in years," Cori patiently responded. "But I did bring this." She pulled out a preserved, slightly yellowed photograph of herself as a young soldier standing beside her unit in Korea. The guard gave it only a dismissive glance. "That could be anyone. No ID, no entry. Those are the rules." A woman standing nearby in an expensive coat muttered audibly, "How sad. Always some homeless person trying to sneak in for freebies." A few others nearby chuckled under their breath. The guard gestured for Cori to move aside. "Ma'am, you need to step along. There are people waiting." Cori did not argue. Her deep-seated pride kept her back perfectly straight as she turned away. There was no scene, no protest, just quiet dignity as she descended the steps. The wind now cut through her thin jacket more fiercely. She clutched the folded flag she carried. The very flag that had draped her brother's coffin after he was killed in action in Korea, tighter to her chest, protecting it from more than just the cold. She failed to notice a sharply dressed woman across the street who had watched the entire exchange with narrowed eyes and a cell phone already pressed to her ear. Inside the museum, the day's ceremony proceeded exactly as scheduled. The director delivered an eloquent speech on the subjects of sacrifice and duty. A children's choir sang patriotic songs. On large video screens, images showed young, photogenic veterans speaking about their experiences, intercut with polished historical footage. "Today, we honor those who stood in harm's way," the director proclaimed, to enthusiastic applause. "Those brave men and women who placed service above self." Meanwhile, outside, Cori sat on a frigid bench, waiting for the next bus. The flag remained firmly grasped in her hands, a tangible connection to a brother who never returned home, and to comrades who now existed only in her memories. The deep irony was not lost on her. Within those marble walls, people were cheering for the idea of veterans, clean, heroic, conveniently packaged for civilian consumption, while she, in her worn clothes and with unsteady hands, was deemed too untidy for their celebration. She had seen it before, the way America cherished its warriors in theory, but often overlooked them in reality. It no longer sparked anger in her. Disappointment had long since hardened into a quiet resignation. Across town, in a nondescript government complex, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Jensen strode purposefully down a polished corridor, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. A combat veteran with 20 years of dedicated service, Jensen was not a man who tolerated injustice, especially when it involved veterans. He knocked once on a heavy oak door before entering. "Sir, there's a situation at the National Veterans Museum I felt you should be immediately apprised of." General Marcus Reed looked up from his desk, 4 stars gleaming distinctly on each shoulder of his uniform. At 62, Reed was a living legend in military circles, a highly decorated combat veteran, a respected strategist, and a fierce, uncompromising advocate for everyone who had served under him. "What kind of situation, Colonel?" he asked. "I witnessed a veteran being refused entry to today's ceremony," Jensen began efficiently. "An elderly woman, Korean and Vietnam era, judging by the insignia on her jacket. Security turned her away for lack of proper ID." Reed's expression darkened. "Details." Jensen provided them swiftly. The old soldier's quiet dignity, the guard's abrupt dismissal, the bystanders' crude mockery. He knew the general well enough to recognize the controlled fury building behind his professional composure. "There's more, sir," Jensen added. "I had someone run a check on the name she gave, Cora Hayes." He placed a thin folder squarely on Reed's desk. 38th Infantry Regiment in Korea, later served with 5th Special Forces in Vietnam. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. General Reed opened the folder and went completely still. "Hayes? Cora Hayes, are you certain?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Reed's finger slowly traced a line in the file. Then he looked up, his expression utterly transformed. "Clear my schedule. Have my vehicle ready in 5 minutes." He took a breath, his voice strained with emotion. "Sir, this just became personal. Corporal Cora Hayes saved my father's life at Incheon. She pulled him from a burning tank under enemy fire. If not for that woman, I wouldn't be standing here today." Within minutes, a convoy of black government SUVs was speeding toward the museum, lights flashing, but sirens silent. Inside the lead vehicle, General Reed sat ramrod straight, his face set in grim, unyielding determination. The convoy pulled up to the museum's entrance with military precision. Staff and visitors turned in surprise as General Reed emerged, his uniform immaculate and his presence instantly commanding attention. Inside, the ceremony was still in full swing. The same security guard who had refused Cori was still checking IDs, still maintaining his arbitrary barrier between those he deemed worthy and those who were not. He looked up as heavy boots approached, his eyes widening at the sight of a 4-star general bearing down on him. "Sir, welcome to—" "Where is she?" Reed's voice cut through the ambient noise like a sharpened blade. "I'm sorry, sir?" "The veteran you turned away. Where is she?" The guard swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. There was an elderly woman without proper ID. But you don't belong here, old man. This is for real veterans," General Reed quoted, his voice echoing across the marble foyer. "That's what you said to her, isn't it?" The museum director, alerted by the commotion, hurried over. "General Reed, what an honor. Is there a problem?" Reed turned to the director, his voice dangerously calm. "The problem is that while you are giving eloquent speeches about honoring veterans, you have staff turning away actual heroes at the door." The gathered crowd fell completely silent. Reporters, sensing a much better story unfolding than the planned ceremony, moved closer, cameras at the ready. "Where is the woman you just humiliated?" Reed demanded. The museum director paled, glancing frantically between the imposing general and his suddenly paralyzed security guard. "There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome all veterans with proper identification." "Proper identification," General Reed repeated the words, sharp with contempt. "Tell me, have you ever seen what happens to military IDs after 60 years? They yellow, they crack, they fall apart, just like the bodies of the men and women who carried them through hell." General Reed turned to address the silent crowd, his voice carrying throughout the marble hall. "You had a recipient of the Bronze Star with valor standing on your steps, and you locked the door in her face." A collective gasp rippled through the visitors. Phone cameras were raised immediately, capturing the extraordinary moment. "Cora Hayes," the general continued, his voice briefly cracking with emotion. "She saved my father's life at the Battle of Incheon. She dragged him from a burning tank while under enemy fire, suffering severe burns to her own hands. My family owes its very existence to that woman." The director's face had changed from pale to ashen. "General, I had no idea." "Of course you had no idea," Reed cut him off. "Because you've reduced honoring veterans to a photo opportunity, to speeches and banners, and to convenient heroes who fit your image of what service should look like." Lieutenant Colonel Jensen approached, speaking quietly into the general's ear. Reed nodded once, then addressed a junior officer. "Find Ms. Hayes immediately." The museum had fallen into complete silence. The ceremony in the main hall had unofficially paused as word spread about the confrontation. General Reed turned back to the director. "Do you know why Cora Hayes wasn't wearing her full decorations today? Why she only had that single bronze star pinned to her jacket?" The director shook his head mutely. "Because her other medals are displayed in her brother's home. Lieutenant James Hayes, killed in action in Korea. Cori gave them to her brother's widow, telling her that they belonged to the real hero in the family." Reed's voice conveyed both anger and profound respect. "That is the kind of person you just turned away." Outside, across the plaza, Cori sat on the bench dusted with light snow, still tightly clutching the folded flag. The bus was late, or perhaps she had simply missed it during her quiet reverie. At her age, time sometimes slipped away. She looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, crisp, measured steps that she instantly recognized as military. A young officer in a sharp dress uniform stopped directly before her, rendering a perfect salute. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "General Reed requests your presence, ma'am." Cori blinked in surprise. "General Reed?" "Yes, ma'am, if you'll come with me." Confused but intrigued, Cori allowed the officer to help her to her feet. As they crossed the plaza, she noticed the black vehicles at the entrance and the small crowd gathered outside. At the top of the steps stood a figure in full dress uniform, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder. As Cori approached, the general stepped forward and rendered a sharp, formal salute. "Master Sergeant Hayes," General Reed said, using Cori's highest rank. "I'm Marcus Reed. My father was Lieutenant William Reed, 38th Infantry, September 14th, 1950. Cori's eyes widened in stunned recognition. "Little Billy Reed's boy." A genuine smile spread across her weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. You've done your daddy proud with those stars." "He made sure I knew your name, ma'am," the general replied. "Made sure I understood what real courage looks like." Around them, a large crowd had gathered. Museum staff, visitors, reporters, and the officers who had accompanied General Reed. One by one, the military personnel present came to attention and saluted. Then, civilians began to show their respect as well, some placing hands over their hearts, others bowing their heads in silent recognition. For the first time in decades, Cora Hayes stood at her full height, shoulders back, not just an old woman in a worn jacket, but a soldier being recognized for who she truly was. "We've got some unfinished business inside, Sergeant," General Reed said, offering his arm for support. There's a ceremony honoring veterans, and it's missing its guest of honor." Together, they walked back up the steps and through the doors that had been closed to Cori just an hour before. The security guard stepped aside, eyes downcast. The museum director began a stammered apology. General Reed silenced him with a look. "Save it. Instead, I suggest you listen carefully to what a real veteran has to say." Cori, for her part, took it all in with quiet dignity. As they entered the main hall, she leaned closer to the general. "You didn't have to do all this, son," she said softly. "With all due respect, Master Sergeant Hayes," Reed replied. "Yes, I absolutely did." By the following morning, the story had gone instantly viral. Cell phone videos capturing General Reed's dramatic confrontation circulated widely, as did images of Cora Hayes being escorted into the ceremony as its most honored guest. Major news networks picked up the account, finding in it a powerful narrative about recognition, respect, and the often invisible veterans living in our midst. The museum director resigned within 48 hours, citing personal reasons, but fooling no one. The security guard was reassigned after issuing a public apology. More significantly, the museum's board announced a complete overhaul of their veteran access policies, effective immediately. Their statement read, "All self-identified veterans will be welcomed with respect and dignity. Our staff will receive specialized training in recognizing and honoring military service in all its forms, not just through IDs and papers, but through understanding and compassion." Cora Hayes found herself reluctantly thrust into the national spotlight. Interview requests poured in, which she mostly declined. "I'm not the story," she insisted. "There are thousands like me, just less visible." Nevertheless, her quiet dignity struck a chord nationwide. Veterans organizations reported a surge in public support. Retirement homes noted increased volunteer applications. Schools requested veteran speakers for special assemblies. The museum itself dedicated an entire new wing to the forgotten warriors, specifically honoring veterans often overlooked because of their age, appearance, or circumstance. Cori was invited to cut the ribbon at its opening, which she did with characteristic humility. Most meaningful to Cori was the bench, a simple wooden seat installed near the museum entrance bearing a small bronze plaque reserved for those who served. It became an unspoken tradition that no one, regardless of status, would sit there if a veteran was standing nearby. Every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting, Cori could be found near that bench, sometimes sitting quietly, other times sharing stories with younger veterans or curious children. She was seen not as a homeless-looking old woman, but as a living link to history, a keeper of memories that might otherwise be lost. And across the city, in silent salutes and small acts of recognition, an important lesson spread. You never know the battles someone has fought just by looking at them. True respect means looking beyond the surface to honor the service within. Subscribe to She Wore the Stars if you believe no veteran should ever be turned away from their own legacy, because true honor isn't worn, it's earned.